Cretaceous was a name given to a group of rock layers, and the name comes from creta, which is Latin for chalk. And of course, the classic example are the chalk cliffs at Dover, the White Cliffs, but also along the English Channel coast, from around Bournemouth and that. But also there's chalk that outcrops in the Yorkshire coast, and there's chalk that outcrops over in Northern Ireland. And it's interesting, so the Cretaceous group of rock units was named after the chalk because it was a prominent. Chalk is a type of limestone, and you look at it under the microscope, it's made up of tiny little microscopic shellfish called coccolithophores and foraminifera. They're scientific terms for the want of it. But there's two observations we can make, is that you can trace those chalk beds because they're so distinctive. You can trace them all the way across Europe. You can find them in Germany and Poland, not necessarily at the surface, but they're intersected by drilling and by mining. And we find the same chalk beds are found in Egypt, in Israel. I can take you to a valley where a shepherd boy picked up 5 smooth stones to go and slay a giant, and the cliff there is chalk. You can go to Kazakhstan and see the same chalk beds, and you can actually trace a continuously from the Middle East right across Europe, right across England, across to Northern Ireland and out onto the coast of the Atlantics over there in the west. The same chalk beds at the same level with the same fossils are found in the Midwest of the United States, from Arkansas to northwards to Nebraska, and across to Colorado. A huge area of the United States is covered, and the same chalk beds at the same level, called the Cretaceous, is found in southern Western Australia. Now remember, these are marine creatures, and the interesting thing is they're buried on the continents. Now, most people, the conventional scientific community knows that, but they don't realise the significance. Where do these creatures live? They live on the ocean. Where are they buried? Up on the continents. How would they get there unless the ocean flooded the continent? And the interesting thing, the chalk is actually a ginormous, that's in the dictionary now, ginormous fossil graveyard. You know what a graveyard is? It's where you bury dead things, dead people. Well, these are all dead animals. They're microscopic, and there's trillions and trillions of them. They're buried in a graveyard that you can see stretches right across Europe to the Middle East, and we can see it again in Northern America, and we can see it again in Western Australia. And the indications are that these deposits were global in extent. The evidence indicates that at that time all the continents were covered with ocean waters, and so the Cretaceous is definitely an outstanding example of what we'd expect based on what the Bible says. I often say to people, look, if the Bible is really true, it says all the high hills under the whole of the mountains were covered, and all animals perished that were on the earth except for those in the ark, then what would we expect to find? We'd expect to find billions of dead things called fossils buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. We'd expect to find marine creatures buried on the continents. We'd expect to find layers that stretch right across continents and be traced between continents because the ocean waters would cover the whole earth. Now here's the interesting thing. Most people don't realise that the scientists, conventional scientists, say, but we can explain the chalk beds. It's quite simple. We can go to the ocean floor today and we can examine that on the ocean floor we find thin layers of what they call calcareous ooze. And if that ooze accumulates enough, it'll eventually form a big enough layer to form limestone, to form chalk. And sure enough, you get similar fossils in that ooze. But here's the interesting thing. They say that it takes 1,000 years to accumulate a fraction of an inch. Well, how is it that in the chalk beds in Kansas, we find buried fish 14 feet long with another fish inside its stomach undigested? Is that fish going to stick around for thousands of years without digesting that fish it just ate, waiting for it to be slowly buried and fossilised? we find dinosaurs and birds in the same chalk beds. We find dinosaurs in the chalk that's been found in the Netherlands, the same chalk beds. We find ammonites in the chalk beds in England. These are large creatures. They don't hang around for thousands of years waiting to be slowly buried and fossilised. And the purity of the chalk doesn't even compare with the ooze. The chalk is usually 95 to 99% pure calcium carbonate. The ooze on the ocean floor is nowhere near the same purity. So the ooze on the ocean floor cannot be an example of how chalk forms. The chalk has every indication that it was catastrophic processes rapidly accumulating and burying all these creatures on a ginormous scale in layers that went across continents, can even be traced on a global scale, which is exactly what we'd expect from the biblical record of the flood.